Hey guys, so one thing that was brought up in the Bronies React video to the New Generation film is some of them, like Lost Narrator, Black Griffin, and a few others, kind of brought up the possibility that some of these members of the main five, like Izzy, like Zip, perhaps, you know, that, and Pip, and even Sunny, I think, to an extent, Hitch, if you will, that, perhaps they could be, descendants, unbeknownst to them, that is, descendants of some of the main six. And that kind of would make sense. I mean, that would be a real connection between the generations, and in a story sense would kind of add up to, why these characters have, these, I wouldn't just say abilities, but these gifts, if you will, to where they're able to do certain things you wouldn't expect them to do. Like Izzy, even though she has a Pinkie Pie-like persona, is very creative and, very, I guess you could say very creative, very fashion sensible and all that, just like Rarity. And a lot of people look at the fact that, maybe she's a descendant of both, but the question would be, how is that possible? How is Izzy a descendant of Rarity or even Pinkie, if not both at the same time? And some could assume that maybe, when you really think about it, Pinkie did have a kid in Little Cheese. Now, Little Cheese, depending on whether or not it was a boy or a girl, a lot of people were saying, and even those that, wrote the series finale said it was a boy, Little Cheese could have grown up and maybe met a descendant of, of Rarity. Because for all we know, Rarity may have had a kid, but we don't know, who it would have been with. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us are hoping and pretty much are certain, just based off the way, the series ended and the way they were kind of putting it back into focus and all that in season 8 and Best Gift Ever, and in some parts of season 9, that being Spike and Rarity. We could assume that her kid was, a child. Her kid was the daughter, or basically her kid was the daughter of her and Spike. We could assume that. Not saying that's totally true. So, maybe there's a good chance that Little Cheese hooked up with, Rarity and Spike's daughter, for all we know. And if that happened, then that would explain why Izzy, probably down the line, throughout the generations, and maybe other past generations before her, like other past, ancestral members before her, gained a bit of the, I guess you can say, combined persona and creativity of both Pinkie and Rarity. That could be something to explain why Izzy is the way she is. Now you might say, well, what about Zip? Zip seems very like a modern day scientific mathematical or mathematician, I should say, version of Rainbow Dash, and that is true. But from what we could tell at the end of the series, from an LGBTQ standpoint, Rainbow and Applejack hooked up. Now that doesn't mean, perhaps, that they didn't probably do what's known as adoption. And if they did, maybe that's how, they had a kid, and that kid maybe have hooked up with someone on the Pegasus side of things that was intelligent. Who knows? Or maybe, let's not forget, Applejack does have a nephew. She has a nephew or a niece, depending on how you view it. I think they said it was a niece, from Big Mac and Sugar Bell. So maybe the niece hooked up perhaps with a Pegasus, and because the niece may have carried some of Applejack's genes and all that, that perhaps that's what got passed on to Zip, if you will. That may have been what got passed on to Zip. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, Zip kind of acts like Rainbow Dash, like when they're getting ready to do the glow up situation, make themselves into unicorns for the purpose of getting the crystal and bridalwood. You might say, well, she acted somewhat like Rainbow Dash, like, whoa, I didn't sign up for this kind of deal. And that is true. That is true. That's kind of very similar to Rainbow Dash, but it's also very similar to Applejack to an extent. Applejack is the same way, but both Apple and Rainbow are willing to have to get all frilly, if you will, all glamored up or glowed up, if you will, for whatever situation they have to be in. I mean, we saw it in simple ways with Applejack becoming Apple Jewel. We've seen it with Rainbow dressing up several times for the big gala night deal at season 1's finale, as well as the Canterlot wedding and a few others, as well as the fact that she dressed up to kind of distract Zephyr Breeze in the 200th episode. So we know they're capable of doing that. But we also both know that they, that what makes them alike and what makes them friendly rivals at times is the fact that they both have similar traits. And one of those similar traits is not, liking to dress up all the time, in very freely feminine kind of clothing. They like to be the tomboyish selves, if you know what I mean. So, who's to say, like I said, that, maybe the niece of Applejack and Rainbow Dash, growing up around them, didn't, kind of pick up on their traits and maybe pass that on to the generation after them with whoever they hooked up with from the Pegasus side of things. And maybe the person they hooked up with on the Pegasus side of things may have been a descendant of, Spitfire. I mean, I know some people say Spitfire probably passed on, as evident in the future timeline of the finale. Before we know, maybe Spitfire retired and wanted to start a family. We don't know, because we don't see her and Soren. So maybe both of them retired to start a family. It's a possibility. So let's assume maybe that Applejack and Rainbow's niece, Sugar Belle and Big Mac's daughter, hooked up maybe with Spitfire and Soren's kid, and there you go. And maybe that's what led to, let's say, Zip, basically being, probably a descendant of them. Now, you might say, well, where does this leave Pip? Because Pip's very rarity-like at times. You can see that. Yes, she is. She's very rarity-like. And I would say that she does come from the Rarity Spike side of things, but that Rarity and Spike, even though I said maybe their kid hooked up with, let's say, Little Cheese, he's down the line, and that started something. Who's to say that they didn't have more than one kid? And if they did, who's to say that kid, whether it was a son or a daughter, or maybe a descendant, or maybe it's a descendant, let's look at it that way, maybe it's a descendant, a very far descendant, if you will, of Spike and Rarity. Like maybe it's a result, maybe it's a kid of their kid and Pinky and Cheese's kid. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's something like, along those lines, if you will. I was just checking the time there. Maybe it's something along those lines. And maybe the grandchild, if you will, granddaughter, grandson, whatever, may have hooked up with perhaps, maybe they hooked up with maybe a Pegasus, for all we know. And there you go. I mean, I'm not saying that's entirely true, but you never know, because Pip does carry some of those Rarity-like traits. So even though it would be generations after generations, it would take place a couple of generations later, who's to say she didn't inherit some of those Rarity traits from, her from her grandmother or her great grandmother. Who's to say that? So basically, I think Pip is connected to Rarity and Spike, especially when you look at the fact that her wings are feathery. What other Pegasi do you know of has had, feathery wings? Not anybody I know of, right? So I'm gonna assume that she is a descendant of the Rarity. That she has I'm gonna assume this. Sorry about that. I'm gonna assume this. That when you get down to it, I think Izzy and Pip, the revelation is they're gonna be a lot closer. Kind of in family, a lot closer, kind of in like relativity than what's being led on. Kind of similar to what Generation 4 did with Pinkie Pie and Applejack. I'm thinking they're going to probably do something like that with Pip and Izzy, because they, even though, Izzy is like a Pinkie, she's creative. And even though Pip is very feminine, like a Rarity and everything, I could see them doing something like that with those two, in the series. Like they find out that somehow they are, distant family because of these situations that I mentioned. Now you might say, well, what about Hitch? We know that Fluttershy was a Pegasus. How is Hitch related to her? Well, here's the thing. A lot of people pretty much assume, and rightfully so, that Discord and Fluttershy got together, right? But who's to say that maybe, whatever child they may have had, if you will, didn't, inherit perhaps a trait from Fluttershy and then passed it on throughout the generations, or maybe, if you will, Zephyr Breeze. Let's say Zephyr Breeze, despite how people may not like him and how he comes off, maybe he finally found somebody, believe it or not, and maybe they had a child, and that child, basically became kind of like the grandfather, maybe, or great-grandfather of Hitch. In other words, Hitch, may be the great-great-grandson of Fluttershy. And perhaps we find out that his, great-grandmother was a regular Earth pony while the father was a Pegasus. It's possible. It's possible to look at it that way because you see, the similarity with him, attracting other animals to him. And the same could be, and now you might ask, well, what about Sunny Star Scout? I think Sunny Star Scout, believe it or not, is a descendant of Twilight. Now you might say, well, Twilight's an alicorn. How is that possible? Hear me out. I'm not necessarily saying a descendant by blood. I'm saying a descendant by sort of like a connection. In other words, she's a descendant of Twilight by, I guess you could say, magic being passed on, or Twilight, pretty much mentoring those that, like Celestia mentored her, mentoring those that she feels are going to be the ones that, help Equestria into the future. And in honesty, if I was to say she's a true descendant of somebody, I would say she's a true descendant of Starlight and Sunburst. And you got to remember, the reason she would have a strong, close connection to Twilight and kind of treat her like a descendant is because of the fact that Starlight was Twilight's pupil. As I take something here. But like I said, it would be because Twilight was Starlight's pupil. They lived together and they became practically family. So in a sense, maybe you could consider Sunny to be family to Twilight if she's still around, but a descendant of her, in a sense, or a chosen one like her, because of the fact that she's a descendant of Starlight and Sunburst. So, there you go. Maybe that's why she is a chosen one, because she descends bloodline-wise from Sunburst and Starlight, but because Starlight has that close connection, with Twilight, there's a good chance that got passed on, believe it or not, through that strong connection and bond between Starlight and Twilight, down to Sunny through the generations. So there's that. It's possible. And again, you got to look at how Argyle was, portrayed somewhat in the movie as well, and that might have a connection to that too. But maybe I'm wrong. But what do you think? Do you think maybe we'll find out that some of the main 5 may be connected descendant-wise to some of the main 6 in some unique way? Do you think we'll get another Applejack Pinkie Pie situation with Pip and Izzy? What are your thoughts? Let me know down in the comments section below. So also the live chat during the premiere, where super chats and super stickers are open and encouraged if you can do it. And until next time, guys, I got to get in and clock in for work today. And I'm out. I'll talk to y'all later.